The wind on Kordesh moved like a wounded animal, low, keening, directionless. It lifted fine particles of rust-colored dust and spun them into lazy spirals that collapsed as quickly as they formed. The sky had no business being that shade of orange, a perpetual bruise stretching from horizon to horizon, left over from something the Vrek's historical databases preferred not to discuss. Kazir watched the human woman through his tactical visor, which painted her in targeting red and supplied a stream of biometric data that made no sense. She sat cross-legged on the ground, right there, in the center of a kill circle formed by 50 Vrek's Dominion shock troopers, the finest close-quarters combatants in 7 sectors. Their armored carapaces gleamed with reactive plating, plasma rifles humming at full charge, targeting solutions locked onto her skull, her spine, her heart. She wasn't looking at any of them. Her fingers sifted through the dirt, letting the dust fall in thin rivulets, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something the wind was saying. Subject appears unarmed, his tactical officer reported from the command skiff hovering 200 meters back. No energy signatures, no cybernetic enhancements we can detect. Clothing is standard Terran diplomatic attire, fabric weave, no armor plating. Kazir's secondary heart pumped faster than his primary. Every instinct honed over 4 decades of combat told him this was wrong. The humans had sent one envoy, to negotiate a territorial dispute that had already cost the Vrek's Dominion 3 cruisers and 1,700 warriors. "Scan again," he growled. Scanning. Results unchanged. The woman, Ambassador Tactical Liaison Mara Voss, according to the diplomatic credentials her government had transmitted 12 hours prior, looked up. Her eyes found Kazir's position with unsettling precision, as though the armored ridge he crouched behind was not a barrier but a suggestion. "Is the ground always this dusty?" she asked. "Or did it rain recently?" The question landed like a misfired charge. Several troopers shifted their weight. One audibly reset his weapon's power cell, a nervous tell that Kazir would punish later. Vex Commander Trell, stationed at Kazir's left, let out a guttural laugh. "She mocks us. Let me open her throat." Kazir raised one clawed hand. "Hold position." He magnified his visor feed. The human's face showed no fear, no bravado, no chemical calm induced by combat stimulants. Her expression held the quiet, absorbed quality of someone doing field work, a geologist cataloging strata, a biologist examining soil samples. "The dust composition suggests a bombardment event," Mara continued, rubbing a pinch of grit between her thumb and forefinger. "High temperature, atmospheric interaction, 200 standard cycles, give or take 30. Am I close?" None of the 50 elites spoke. The wind answered instead, carrying her words across the plain. Kazir felt his threat assessment subroutines flicker, then reset, then flicker again. The human's question about the dust was not listed in any diplomatic scenario his training had covered. He had prepared for threats, for negotiations, for desperate pleas and dignified defiance. He had not prepared for geology. "Why do you ask this?" he finally said, his voice amplified through his helmet's external speaker. Mara let the remaining dust fall from her palm. She watched it drift on the wind, tracking the particulate dispersal with those calm, methodical eyes. "Because I'd like to know how long my people have been watching this planet," she said, "and whether the Vrek's Dominion ever bothered to ask what happened here before you claimed it." The tactical display on Kazir's visor flickered yellow, then amber. Anomalous readings. Unidentified particulate signatures. Deep ground composition analysis returning correlations flagged by the shipboard database as high-priority historical match. "What happened here?" Kazir repeated, the question escaping before he could stop it. Mara smiled. It was not a predatory expression. It was the smile of a teacher watching a student finally approach the right question. "That's exactly what I'm trying to tell you," she said. "If you're willing to listen." Commander Trell was not willing to listen. His claws had been curled around the grip of his rifle for the past 7 minutes, and his combat glands had flooded his system with aggression pheromones that the other troopers could smell through their filters. "She's stalling," Trell hissed over the private channel. Terran standard procedure: delay, distract, deploy hidden assets. We execute her now and reposition before. Before what? Kazir cut him off. Before the fleet that is undoubtedly watching us right now decides our execution posture requires a response. There is no fleet. The orbital scans are clean. The system perimeter is clean. She came alone. Kazir wanted to believe that. The sensor data supported it. Every Vrex installation in the Kordash system had reported negative contact for the past 72 hours. The Terran diplomatic shuttle that delivered Mara had entered atmosphere, touched down at the designated coordinates, and departed without a single anomalous energy reading. She was alone. The tactical absurdity of it continued to gnaw at him. "What do you know about this world's geological history?" Mara asked, rising slowly to her feet. The 50 rifles tracked her movement with mechanical precision. She ignored them, brushing reddish dust from the knees of her dark trousers. "We know it serves the Dominion's strategic needs," Kazir replied. "That's not geology, that's real estate." Trellquote's grip tightened. "Let me stand down." Kazir stepped out from behind the armored ridge, exposing himself fully for the first time. His massive frame, encased in reactive plating that had absorbed plasma fire in 18 major engagements, cut an imposing silhouette against the orange sky. "I will speak with this human directly." The shock troopers parted to let him through, their formation adjusting with drilled precision. Kazir walked until he stood 3 meters from Mara Voss, close enough to see the dust clinging to her hair, the fine lines around her eyes, the utter absence of tension in her shoulders. "The Dominion claimed Kordash 72 standard cycles ago," he said. "There were no prior inhabitants, no existing structures, no evidence of previous occupation. The world was barren." Mara nodded slowly. "It is now." She knelt again, scooping another handful of dust. This time she held it up toward Kazir, as though offering him something precious. "Do you see these particles? The angular shatter pattern, the glassy inclusions?" She rotated her palm, letting the sunlight catch the tiny reflective fragments mixed among the rust-red grit. "This isn't natural erosion. This is what topsoil looks like after it's been flash-heated to silicate melting point and then pulverized by atmospheric overpressure waves." Kazir-Quote's visor translated her words into tactical data. The correlations were immediate. His display flagged silicate melting point, atmospheric overpressure, and flash-heated topsoil as indicators of Type 9 or higher orbital bombardment. "When?" he asked. 237 standard cycles ago. Give or take." Mara let the dust fall. "My government's archives have extensive records. The Kordash system was once inhabited by a species called the Altith. Early spacefaring. No faster-than-light capability, peaceful by most measures. They refused to join the Terran Accord and asked to be left alone, so we left them alone, for about 40 years. "What happened?" Mara met his gaze. "Someone else found them, someone who didn't leave them alone. By the time our nearest fleet received the distress signal and arrived in system, the Altith cities were glass craters and the atmosphere was burning. We were too late to save anyone. But we were not too late to file a report." She gestured at the plains around them, the endless, featureless, dust-choked expanse stretching to the horizon in every direction. "This isn't a desert, Kazir. It's a memorial." The wind keened across the empty ground, and for a moment the sound carried something that might have been voices, imagined, projected, the mind filling silence with ghosts. Then Kazir-Quote's tactical display updated with the deep ground scan results, and the flag he had been ignoring finally resolved into clear text. Particulate composition match confirmed. TERATCH Type 12 Strategic Ordnance Residue. Time since deployment, 237.4 Standard CYCLES. He stared at the words, then at the human woman standing calmly in the middle of his 50 elite warriors. The Vrex Dominion had not been the first to claim Kordash. They had simply been the first who were allowed to leave. The Vrex Dominion prided itself on military doctrine refined through centuries of conquest. Their warrior culture celebrated the shock charge, the overwhelming formation, the decisive engagement where strength met strength and the stronger walked away victorious. Their historians cataloged every major battle, every strategic innovation, every conquered species who had failed to match Dominion ferocity. But the human file was thin, suspiciously thin. Khazir had requested access to the complete Terran military intelligence dossier 3 times during his career. Each time, the request had been denied at levels far above his pay grade. The fragments he had gathered from veterans, from rumor, from the edges of classified briefings, painted a picture that refused to resolve into coherence. Human soldiers who moved through active combat zones without triggering a single sensor. Fleets that bypassed Dominion perimeter defenses using gravitational vectors that physics should not allow. A garden world called Telleris 9, where an entire Dominion garrison had gone silent overnight. No battle, no bodies, no sign of struggle, just 70,000 warriors who had laid down their weapons and walked into the sea. "What do your commanders tell you about us?" Mara asked, as though reading his thoughts from the subtle shifts of his posture. Khazir's secondary heart was beating harder now. "That you are persistent, that you prefer diplomacy to confrontation, that your military capacity has been exaggerated for psychological effect. And what do you believe?" The question hung in the dusty air. 50 plasma rifles were still aimed at Mara's vital organs, but Khazir noticed something that made his blood run colder than any threat. Not a single trooper had fired. Not because they were waiting for his order, but because they were listening. "I believe," Khazir said carefully, "that you would not have come here alone unless you were absolutely certain you would leave alive." Mara's expression flickered. For just a moment something passed behind her eyes, not triumph, not satisfaction, but recognition. The look of a professional acknowledging another professional. "That's the difference between your people and mine," she said. "Your military culture is built around the willingness to die. Ours is built around the refusal to let anyone force that choice." She turned her back on him, actually turned her back, and walked several paces away, eyes scanning the horizon as though looking for landmarks that no longer existed. 237 years ago, the species that burned this world made a critical error. They assumed that because the Altoth were peaceful, they were weak. They assumed that because we hadn't intervened before, we wouldn't intervene at all. They assumed that the vast distances between stars would protect them from consequences. She stopped walking. They were wrong about all three. Vex Commander Trell had gone very still. Khazir could hear him breathing over the private channel, shallow, rapid, the respiration of a warrior confronting something his training had not prepared him for. "What happened to them?" Trell demanded. "The ones who did this." Mara turned back to face them. The orange sky silhouetted her, casting her features into shadow, but her voice carried with perfect clarity across the dusty plain. "Nothing," she said. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. "Nothing," Khazir repeated. "We left their worlds intact. We left their cities standing. We left their fleets operational and their government functional and their population alive and unaware that anything had changed." She paused. "What we did was remove their capacity to ever harm another species, quietly, surgically, without them realizing it was happening until it was done." Their military command structure developed structural weaknesses that prevented coordinated deployment. Their weapons research programs encountered funding obstacles and personnel shortages, and supply chain disruptions that all traced back to independent, unrelated decisions. Their political alliances fractured along fault lines that had been carefully widened over decades. She began walking back toward Khazir, her footsteps leaving shallow impressions in the reddish dust. "They're still out there. Still alive, still thinking they're a power, but they haven't launched a hostile operation in 190 cycles, because every time they try something goes wrong, something always goes wrong, and they have no idea that it's us." Mara stopped in front of him close enough that he could see the dust on her eyelashes. "That's the myth of human combat, Warlord. We don't fight wars, we end them, sometimes with fire, sometimes with patience. The fire gets remembered. The patience is what you should be afraid of." Khazir's tactical display had been trying to get his attention for the past 43 seconds. He had been ignoring it, his focus locked on the impossible human woman who spoke of century-spanning vengeance with the calm of someone discussing weather patterns. But the alert had escalated from amber to pools in crimson, and when he finally glanced at the data, He felt his primary heart stop. The deep layer soil analysis had finished processing. The results were worse than he had imagined. "Your face," Mara observed. "You've just seen the full report. How long have you known?" "Since before I landed. The shuttle's atmospheric sensors confirmed the particulate composition at 30,000 meters, but I needed to see it on the ground. I needed to touch it." Kazir's mind was racing through the implications. The Type 12 warheads that had transformed Kordash from a living world into a dust-choked graveyard had not simply killed the Altith. They had saturated the soil with marker isotopes, engineered particles designed to persist for millennia, detectable by any Terran sensor array that passed within scanning range. The dust itself was a signal, a beacon, a message written into the planetary crust that said, "Humanity was here. Humanity remembers. Humanity will know if you return." "Your government has been aware of our occupation since it began," Kazir said. "It was not a question." "Since before it began," Mara confirmed. "We detected your first survey probe 72 years ago. We watched you establish your forward bases. We watched you deploy your garrisons. We watched you move 17,000 civilian settlers into prefabricated habitats in the southern lowlands." She paused. "We've been watching the entire time. And you did nothing. We had no reason to do anything. The Altith are gone. Their world is barren. Your presence here doesn't threaten any living species." Mara's tone remained neutral, but something in her posture sharpened. "But then you started expanding, outward from Kordash, toward systems that are inhabited, toward species who fall under our protection agreements. Your dominion has been pushing boundaries, testing responses, seeing what you can take without consequences." Vex Commander Trell had abandoned his position and was now standing directly beside Kazir, his rifle lowered, his combat glands emitting confusion pheromones instead of aggression. "The other systems," Trell said hoarsely, "the ones we've been moving toward, they're under our protection," Mara said. "All of them, every single one. And the forces you've been positioning for annexation are now inside an exclusion zone that your intelligence services didn't know existed, because we never filed the boundaries with any government you could access." Kazir's communication array crackled. Not with a local signal, this was coming from orbit. From dozens of sources, all transmitting simultaneously on channels that his equipment had been scanning for hours without finding anything. The voice that came through was not Mara's. It was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of negotiation. "Warlord Kazir of the Vrex Dominion, this is Terran Strategic Command Vessel Witness. We have been monitoring this interaction and wish to confirm Ambassador Voss's statements. The Kordash system exists within a Terran historical preservation zone. Your occupation has been tolerated. Your expansion will not be. You have 30 standard minutes to begin withdrawal procedures, or your orbital assets will be reassigned to debris classification." The channel went silent. Mara looked up at the orange sky, which was no longer empty. High above, barely visible through the dust-choked atmosphere, shapes were resolving, dark geometries blotting out the stars, arranged in a perfect sphere around the planet. "I told you," she said softly. "We don't fight wars. We end them. This one ended before it started. The only question left is whether your people get to walk away." Vrek's orbital defense network consisted of 41 weapons platforms, 12 patrol cruisers, and a garrison station housing 8,000 personnel. It had been considered sufficient to defend against any threat the sector could produce. Every single asset was painted by human targeting lasers within 90 seconds of the fleet's decloaking. Kazir watched the feeds on his visor in stunned silence. The human warships had not appeared on long-range sensors. They had not dropped out of faster-than-light transit with the characteristic energy bloom that Dominion tracking stations were designed to detect. They had simply emerged from the darkness between stars, 63 vessels, ranging from frigate-class hunters to capital ships that massed more than the entire Vrex presence in the system combined. And they had placed themselves in a perfect sphere around Kordash, equidistant from the planet's core, their weapons arrays aligned to create overlapping fields of fire that left not a single cubic meter of Vrex-held space uncovered. "Commandant Veles is hailing us," Trell reported, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. The orbital garrison is requesting engagement authorization. Deny it. Warlord, do you see those targeting solutions? They're not just locked onto our weapons platforms. They're locked onto the platform's power cores, the cruiser's bridge compartments, the garrison's life support systems. They've had firing solutions since before we knew they existed. Kazir's voice was steady, but his primary heart was hammering against his ribs. If we fire a single shot, every Vrex asset in orbit becomes a debris cloud. Mara had resumed her seat on the dusty ground, legs folded, hands resting on her knees. She appeared to be waiting with the patience of someone who had already done the difficult part of her job and was now simply allowing time to pass. "You're not going to fire," she said. "Your command structure is aggressive, but it's not suicidal. And the people who gave you those orders, the ones who told you to push into protected space, they knew this might happen. They sent you to find out what we would do." Kazir turned to stare at her. "You're saying my high command expected this. I'm saying your high command has been trying to gauge our response thresholds for decades. Every boundary test, every territorial probe, every accidental incursion, it's all been data collection. They wanted to know where the line was." She gestured at the sky. "Now they know." The implications cascaded through Kazir's mind like a tactical simulation running 1,000 iterations simultaneously. If Mara was correct, if the Dominion leadership had knowingly sent their forces into a potential exclusion zone to provoke a human response, then the 50 elites on this dusty plain were not warriors. They were instruments of measurement, expendable sensors designed to register the killing blow. He had been sent here to die, and to transmit data while dying. The rage that surged through him was hot enough to blur his vision. "Your command used you," Mara said quietly, reading his physiological response with an accuracy that should have been impossible. "They used all of you. The garrison, the orbital platforms. Every Vrex on this planet is here to be a calibration sample. You knew this before you came. I suspected it. Your Dominion's command patterns are not difficult to analyze. Authoritarian hierarchies with centralized decision-making and limited information transparency produce predictable behaviors." She paused. "But I didn't come here to gloat, Warlord. I came here to offer you a choice your commanders didn't give you." Kazir's visor showed the countdown timer, 22 minutes remaining before the human fleet began reclassifying debris. "What choice? Withdraw your forces. Recall your civilian settlers. Cede Kordesh back to its status as a memorial world under Terran protection. Do all of this peacefully, and not a single Vrex life will be lost today." Mara's voice was soft, but every word landed with the weight of an orbital warhead. "Or don't, and become another data point for your commanders to analyze." The wind picked up, sending spirals of reddish dust dancing across the plain. Somewhere in the distance, a Vrex transport lifted off from the southern settlement, its engines a distant roar against the keening air. 20 minutes, Mara said. "I'd start making calls if I were you." Kazir made the calls. Not to his high command, that would come later, and it would be accompanied by words that would probably end his career and possibly his life. He called the garrison commander. He called the civilian settlement administrator. He called the captains of the 12 patrol cruisers who were waiting with weapons charged and crews terrified, praying that someone would give them an order that didn't result in their immediate annihilation. "Stand down," he told each of them. "Power down weapons. Begin withdrawal procedures. No offensive actions. No defensive posturing. Do exactly what the humans tell you to do." The garrison commander, a veteran of 14 campaigns who had never retreated from anything, was the hardest to convince. His voice crackled with disbelief over the encrypted channel. "You're ordering a full withdrawal, on the authority of one human envoy. I'm ordering a withdrawal on the authority of 63 warships that had us surrounded before we knew they were in system. You want to argue tactics, Commander? I'll transfer you to the Terran Fleet Command. I'm sure they'd love to explain their firing solutions." The channel went quiet. Beside Kazir, Mara had produced a small metal canteen from somewhere in her diplomatic attire and was drinking water with the casual air of someone on a hiking excursion. She offered him some. He stared at the container as though she had offered him a live explosive. "You're remarkable," he said finally. "You know that. I'm patient. There's a difference." Your fleet could have destroyed us the moment you arrived. Why the envoy? Why the conversation? Why the, he gestured at the dust, the plain, the carefully delivered history lesson about a dead species and the people who had avenged them so thoroughly that their killers didn't know they had been punished. Because destruction is inefficient. Mara screwed the cap back onto her canteen and tucked it away. If we destroy your fleet today, your Dominion will send another, and another, and another. You'll learn from the engagements, adapt your tactics, develop countermeasures. Eventually you'll find a way to hurt us and we'll have to escalate, and the whole thing spirals until we're forced to make choices that no one wants to make. She rose, brushing the dust from her trousers with the same absent gesture she had used before. Or, she continued, we could have this conversation. One human standing inside your deadliest formation asking you questions about soil composition, making you curious, making you think. Making you realize that the ground you're standing on is already a monument to what happens when we stop being patient. The soft voice, Khazir said, remembering her earlier words. That's what we call it. The soft voice doctrine. It's the oldest one we have, older than the fire, older than the fleet, older than the kill zones and the orbital grids. When we find a new species, a new power, a new potential threat, we send someone to talk. Just one person, unarmed, vulnerable. And we let them demonstrate, through patience and precision and a complete absence of fear, exactly what kind of species they're dealing with. She looked at him, and for the first time, Khazir saw something that might have been compassion in her eyes. The soft voice is a gift, warlord. It's the chance to understand us without suffering the consequences of misunderstanding us. Your commanders have never heard the soft voice. They've only heard rumors, myths, fragmentary reports. Today, you heard it firsthand. And you listened. And if I hadn't, then you would have heard the other one. She didn't need to elaborate. The warships overhead were elaboration enough. Khazir's chronometer showed 9 minutes remaining. The civilian evacuation was already underway, transports lifting from the southern settlement, climbing toward the orbital rendezvous points that the human fleet had designated. The patrol cruisers were powering down their weapons, one by one, their captains acknowledging the withdrawal order with varying degrees of relief and shame. Only one captain had refused to comply, the commander of a frigate called Dominion's Reach, who had declared his intention to engage the human fleet and die with honor. His transmission had been cut off mid-sentence by a precision strike that vaporized his ship's weapons array without breaching the hull. The Dominion's Reach was now drifting dead in space, its crew alive but harmless, its captain learning a very pointed lesson about the difference between honor and stupidity. Your frigate captain will survive, Mara said, as though commenting on a minor traffic incident. His pride may take longer to recover. You knew about that too. I know about everything that happens in this system, warlord. That's the point. The evacuation took 6 hours. Khazir watched it from the command skiff, his tactical displays tracking every transport, every cruiser, every civilian vessel as they filed out of Kordash's gravity well and formed up at the designated departure coordinates. The human fleet maintained its spherical formation throughout, weapons hot but unfired, a silent audience to the Vrek's withdrawal. Mara remained on the plane until the last transport had lifted off from the southern settlement. She had declined Khazir's offer to join him on the skiff, preferring to wait at ground level, alone with the dust and the wind, and whatever ghosts inhabited this memorial world. When she finally boarded the human shuttle that descended to retrieve her, Khazir met her at the loading ramp. He had left his guards behind, his weapons behind, his command authority behind. He was just a warlord standing in the dust, facing a woman who had defeated him without firing a shot. The dust, he said. The marker isotopes, they're still here. You'll always know if we come back. Always, Mara confirmed. And we'll always be watching, but I don't think you'll come back, warlord. I think you understand now, and I think you'll make sure your commanders understand too. And if they don't, she smiled. It was the same smile she had worn when she first asked about the dust, teacherly, patient, carrying depths of knowledge that Khazir was only beginning to fathom. Then I'll come back and we'll have another conversation, maybe somewhere with better weather. She extended her hand. Khazir stared at it for a long moment. The slender human fingers, the pale skin, the complete absence of claws or plating or any natural weaponry. This was the species that had burned a world to glass for a dead ally they had never met. This was the species that had crippled an interstellar empire across 2 centuries of silent, patient, surgical vengeance. This was the species that had surrounded his 50 elites with enough firepower to erase the Kordash system from existence, and then sent a single unarmed woman to ask about geology. He took her hand. Her grip was warm and firm and utterly without malice. "Safe travels, Ambassador. Good luck, Warlord. You're going to need it when you get home." She withdrew her hand and climbed aboard the shuttle. The ramp sealed behind her with a hiss of pressurized hydraulics, and the craft lifted off in a cloud of reddish dust, climbing through the orange sky toward the dark geometries waiting overhead. Kazir watched until the shuttle was a speck, then a memory, then nothing at all. The human fleet departed 30 minutes later. They did not jump to faster than light with a dramatic flash. They simply faded, one by one, their cloaking systems re-engaging as they slid back into the darkness between stars from which they had emerged. Within 10 minutes, the Kordash sky was empty again, just the wind and the dust and the bruised orange horizon stretching to infinity. Kazir ordered his skiff to lift off. As the craft rose, he looked down at the plain where 50 elite warriors had surrounded one unarmed human woman, and where everything he thought he knew about strength and power and victory had been methodically dismantled by a quiet voice asking questions about soil. The dust swirled below, red as old blood, fine as ground glass, carrying in its chemical structure the memory of fire and the promise of patience. It would taste different now, Mara had said. Less bitter. She was right. The extraction shuttle docked with Terran's Strategic Command Vessel Witness, and Mara Voss stepped out of the airlock into the quiet efficiency of a warship that had not needed to fire a single shot. Captain Iskander met her in the corridor, a data slate in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Full withdrawal confirmed. All Vrex assets are clear of the system. The exclusion zone boundaries have been transmitted to Dominion High Command through 17 different channels, including several they don't know we have access to. He handed her the coffee. "Good work down there." Mara accepted the cup and took a long drink. The coffee was terrible, as always, Navy Standard synthetic brew that tasted like someone had waved a coffee bean in the general direction of hot water. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. The frigate captain who tried to engage his crew. "Unharmed. Their life support is stable, and we've transmitted their coordinates to the Vrex fleet. Someone will pick them up within the next day or two. Our targeting systems registered the weapon's discharge attempt 17 seconds before he gave the order. Neural spike detection, very reliable." Mara nodded and walked toward the observation deck, Captain Iskander falling into step beside her. Through the armored viewports, Kordash was a rust-colored marble receding into the distance, its dusty plains and empty settlements slowly shrinking to insignificance. 237 years, she said quietly, and that dust still remembers what we did, every particle. That's by design. I know. She sipped her terrible coffee. "I just wonder sometimes if we'll ever find a species that doesn't need the demonstration, one that just looks at the dust and understands." Captain Iskander considered the question. The Vrex warlord understood in the end. Kazir did, but his commanders sent him here to be a sensor reading. They'll look at his report and see data, not a lesson. She set the coffee aside, her gaze still fixed on the receding planet. "We'll be back here eventually. Maybe not this system, but somewhere. Another border test, another territorial probe, another species that mistakes patience for weakness. And we'll do what we always do." Mara nodded slowly. "We'll send someone to talk, one person, unarmed, and we'll see if they listen." She thought of the Altith, whose cities were glass and whose dust carried a 200-year-old warning. She thought of the empire that had killed them, still stumbling through the galaxy unaware that its decline had been engineered across 2 centuries by patient hands. She thought of Kazir, standing alone on a dusty plain trying to reconcile everything his culture had taught him about strength with the evidence of his own eyes. And she thought of the soft voice, the oldest doctrine, the gentlest weapon, the gift that humanity offered to every new power they encountered. Some accepted it, some didn't, but they all remembered. The Witness engaged its drives, and the orange world of Kordash faded into the starfield. Behind it, in the dust and the wind and the endless keening silence, the marker isotopes continued their vigil, waiting for the next species who would come to claim this world, and the next human envoy who would ask them, calmly and quietly and with terrible patience, whether the ground had always been this dusty.